Hello and welcome to the New Lines podcast. I'm Faisal Al Yafai, and this is a podcast where we delve into some of the biggest ideas, events, and personalities in the Middle East and beyond. Since the war in Ukraine broke out, the impounded super yachts of sanctioned Russian oligarchs have become a familiar sight on news broadcasts worldwide. They serve as visible reminders of the sheer scale of their owners' corruption. Worldwide, it is impossible to precisely measure how much money is lost to corruption like that. The United Nations estimates that kleptocrats, oligarchs, and corrupt officials siphon around $3.6 trillion from their respective countries' economies. It's a staggering amount of money. So where does it all go? Oliver Bullough is an investigative journalist specializing in corruption and financial crime. His latest book, Butler to the World: How Britain Became the Servant of Tycoons, Tax Dodgers, Kleptocrats and Criminals, examines how the UK's financial sector became a major destination, perhaps the major destination, on the transnational money laundering highway. Oliver, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me on.
Well, let's start with the $3.6 trillion question. Where does it all go? When you're dealing with a sum of that size, I wonder if there isn't really a single definitive answer, but the answer in the book seems to be London mainly.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question with many parts to it. Initially, is that $3.6 trillion question. This is an astonishingly large amount of money. We know it's an astonishingly large amount of money, but we don't actually know how much money it is. We don't even have an idea within an order of magnitude how much money it is. There are these various estimates chucked out there, but many of them are just guesses that have been essentially given the status of facts because they've been used repeatedly over and over again. You know, we hear sometimes it's $1 trillion, sometimes it's more, sometimes it's 2 to 5% of global GDP. But these are just guesses because there's never really been any proper work, any proper investigations into how much money is stolen and laundered around the world. This is one of the great failures of the global anti-money laundering setup, is no one's ever really had the curiosity to try and work out how big a problem this is, beyond saying it's clearly a really big problem. So where does the money go? Well, this again is a complicated question because of the nature of how money moves. Criminal money moves between multiple different countries every time it goes through a different country. You know, it can essentially hide behind new shell companies, and it ends up, ever more difficult to find. And the really interesting questions, for me anyway, are where does the money come from? That's clear. It comes from countries of the global south in the main, though not exclusively. Where does it end up? Well, it tends to end up in countries of the global north. And that is where London comes in, because London has this magical combination, really, from the perspective of a kleptocrat or major organized criminal, which is that it's a place where everything is for sale. You can buy anything you like. And it's a place where the enforcement of the rules around anti-money laundering or financial crime are incredibly weak. The investigative agencies, the enforcement agencies are underfunded in a to an almost unimaginable extent. They really can't do anything. So where a lot of the money ends up in London, for the simple reason that if it comes to London, it's safe. It's not only protected by British courts from anyone who challenges it, but it's unlikely to be investigated by any British enforcement agencies because they don't have the time or resources or people to do the job.
You make it sound quite a lawless place, which is intuitively complicated because, of course, most people think of Britain as being very law-abiding.
Yeah, there was a perfect demonstration of this phenomenon earlier this year when a small group of anarchists, there were, as far as I could tell, 4 of them, decided to occupy the house belonging to the Russian tycoon Oliver Bullough. In fact, I think it later became apparent it belonged to a family member of his, but definitely someone related to him. And their occupation was very peaceful. These weren't sort of anarchists rampaging around the house, setting it on fire. They were just sitting on the balcony, dangling their feet over the edge, singing silly songs and occasionally waving to their friends in the rain. That was it. Now, in order to combat this existential threat to law and order, there were, as far as I could tell, around 30 police officers equipped with special gear, cranes, harnesses, in order to try and climb up to winkle these anarchists off the facade of this building. It was complicated by the fact that any time their crane got close to them, the anarchists would just scoot down to the other end of the balcony which meant they had to lower the crane down and start again. It was an absolutely farcical operation. But the reason it's relevant is the fact that 30 police officers to combat 4 anarchists sitting on the balcony of this house. I don't think, I certainly have never heard any suggestion that the origin of the money that went to buy that house was ever investigated by a single police officer.
Well, that's
anyone.
And that was the point.
Right, that's the point right there, right? That you've got, if there's any challenge to property in this country, then it is cracked down on forcefully with the full might of the law. But in terms of crimes committed overseas, potentially, or the origin of money from overseas, no one is interested. The money just comes here, it's spent here, it's welcomed as foreign direct investment. It isn't like, Oleg Deripaska. I mean, Oleg Deripaska, as far as I know, has never been convicted of any crimes, but he is someone who's been of interest to foreign governments. He's been sanctioned in the United States in the past, for example. He's been sanctioned again now, of course. So it wasn't exactly as if the UK authorities could have had no suspicions about him, but they certainly never put any time into investigating where his money came from.
And that's because they benefit from it, of course. I mean, this has to be partly a political question, because the Met Police must have been told at some point, not necessarily on that day, but previously, that if there is any threat to property, that is what needs to be focused on. So that is coming.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right.
I mean, look, I'm not a conspiracist. I don't believe in conspiracies. I don't believe that anyone really in a position of power is sufficiently competent to run a large-scale secret conspiracy without it becoming either falling apart or becoming public. I think this is a far more sinister situation than that. But essentially, we have a long-term situation has been allowed to develop whereby this country has become dependent economically on moving, on processing, on receiving, on packaging up and moving around money of questionable origin. That this is essentially Britain's post-imperial business model. We are no longer the oligarch on our own account anymore. We are no longer building empire on our own account. So we are just advising other people on how to build their own empires, on how to be oligarchs for themselves. That is something we still know how to do. So
but you've said that it's a reputational issue because actually the money, compared to, for example, to the City of London, is actually relatively small.
Yeah, it is. But there is a challenge here, which is something which it took me a little while to figure out, but which I think is absolutely at the core to the whole problem, which is that it isn't only kleptocrats that want secrecy to dodge taxes, to dodge scrutiny, and to avoid any kind of legal repercussions for what they do. It's all rich people. So the challenge is, how do you dissect out the money, the capital flows that belong to kleptocrats or organized criminals from the capital flows that belong to just ordinary rich people who want all the same things as kleptocrats do? Kleptocrats are just, the money they own is no different to any other money. It just happens to come from crime rather than from legitimate business. But as soon as it's in the international financial system, it looks exactly the same. It behaves in exactly the same way, and it ends in exactly the same places. This was demonstrated incredibly clearly in Britain by the government's response to the Danske Bank money laundering scandal. It's certainly either the biggest or the second biggest money laundering scandal of all time, depending on how you count it. And the largest proportion of the funds that moved via Danske Bank's Estonian branch in the years up to 2013 were hidden, their ownership was hidden behind British shell companies, specifically British shell companies, and limited partnerships and limited liability partnerships in the main. This scandal was exposed, it was revealed, it was known about, and this came to Parliament. It was brought to Parliament by some energetic members of Parliament and after having been publicised by some energetic journalists. But the government's response was to deliberately not do anything to solve this problem. And the reason they didn't do anything to solve this problem was not because they wanted to encourage money laundering, but because those same structures were being used by private funds, private investment funds, and they were desperately worried that if they closed this particular loophole, those private investment funds would go off to Luxembourg or to Delaware or somewhere else. So the challenge is that how do you prevent criminal capital flowing through the City of London without also preventing the flow of other capital through the City of London? That, I think, is the dog that scares British government after British government off doing anything about this. And sadly, that means that the victims of financial crime and kleptocracy grow ever more numerous because of our failures in this country to do anything about it.
And that explains, to go back to the Deripaska example, that explains why there was such a large police response, because the police are not necessarily responding just to Deripaska. They're responding, in a sense, to the 100,000 people below him who don't have 200 million. They have just a few million and a couple of houses, and they worry that if the protesters are willing to go after Deripaska and nothing happens, well, what about my $1 million apartment? Things like that. And it's
Of,
those people that the government are concerned about because there's so many of them.
of course, absolutely. I mean, Britain, the title of my book is Butler to the World. Ever since the fact that the book came out in the UK anyway, at a time that was coincidentally almost exactly the same as when Vladimir Putin decided to invade Ukraine, means that obviously most of the focus it has been on Russian oligarchs and how Britain has been the major destination for the wealth of Russian oligarchs. But Britain is not butler to the Russians, it's butler to the world. And the Russians are actually a relatively small share of the country's clients, of Butler Britain's clients. So if anarchists are allowed to invade and occupy a Russian oligarch's house with impunity, that is clearly going to concern a Saudi gentleman who lives next door, an Emirati who lives 3 doors down, an American tech billionaire, maybe perhaps a British billionaire, a Swedish billionaire, a French billionaire. None of them want the idea that anarchists rampaging around the place, breaking into their houses and sitting and singing silly songs on their balconies. So that is the concern right there. Boris
and some
Johnson,
of them, some of them, of course, these people you're talking about, they have political power as well. They're heads of state, or they're daughters of heads of state and things like that.
Yeah, and they are well networked with our ruling class. Boris Johnson, when he was mayor of London, famously said that London is the natural habitat of the billionaire, just like the jungles of Sumatra is the natural habitat of the orangutan. This is a city where billionaires have been encouraged to feel at home for a very, very long time, and anything that makes them feel uncomfortable is a threat to the city's business model.
One of the difficulties with discussing financial crime is that it's not a discussion that's immediately intuitive to most people. It can be very abstract. I mean, it's not as if there are literal suitcases of dirty cash being smuggled up the Thames. So I wonder if you can explain a bit about the mechanism. How does this dirty money come into the City of London? How does it get to the point where estate agents are accepting it for these large houses?
Well, I will briefly stop you there. There are suitcases of dirty money. It is, a very broad spectrum, open opportunity for the criminal economy here. There is huge quantities of dirty cash flowing in and out of London as well. But obviously, the quantity pales into insignificance compared to the volume of electronic money that is flowing in and out of the city every single day. How does the money get here? It gets any way you can imagine. If you can imagine it, that's almost certainly happening. Financial crime, the financial crime services business, London's corruption services economy is incredibly entrepreneurial, very imaginative, endlessly innovating, constantly finding ways of new services to provide for its clients, whether those are, in wealth defense, in wealth movement, in wealth protection, in wealth multiplication. All of these things are very profitable businesses, and inevitably they spread and grow all the time. But in essence, it's a 3-stage process. Someone obtains their wealth. They might obtain it legally, they might obtain it illegally, it doesn't really matter. They obtain their wealth, and then they wish to move their wealth in such a way that its origin is obscured. So you obtain your wealth, you hide your wealth, and then you can spend your wealth. London will help you with the second 2 phases, to hide your wealth and to spend your wealth. Now, in this, London is different to most offshore financial centres, almost all, in fact. A lot of places will help you hide your wealth. Switzerland will help you do that. The British Virgin Islands, Jersey, Cyprus, all of these places will help you hide your wealth. But when it comes to hiding and spending your wealth, London is an almost unique destination for money. So how do you hide it? The simple method is to make sure it isn't owned by you, a person, anymore, but instead is owned by a company which you control, but which it isn't clear that you control. A shell company, a shell structure, a foundation, a trust, a partnership, whatever it might be, something that looks like a legitimate business, but is in fact just a cutout for you yourself. You might want to use multiple different shell companies, because every single one of these, finding out who owns it is a challenge for the law enforcement agencies. And if you use enough of them, they'll never find out who really owns the money. And then, so you've moved the money through multiple jurisdictions and using multiple shell companies until it's finally ended up in a bank in the City of London or in a bank that has access to the City of London. And then once it's here, the world is your oyster. You can do what you like with it. Everything is for sale in the UK. So you can, famously, you can buy yourself a football club. You can buy yourself a mansion. You can buy yourself fine art. You can buy yourself a super yacht. You can find every single person you need to service all of those nice things you've just bought, whether that's football managers, captains for your super yacht, domestic staff for your mansion, or politicians who you can get on the payroll to help you ease your passage into polite society. It's genuinely just a market where everything has a price. And if you haven't, managed to negotiate a price yet, that's just because you're not offering enough money.
I mean, I think this aspect of Britain comes across very strongly in the book, that in contrast to a place like the British Virgin Islands, there's a limited number of things you can buy in the British Virgin Islands. There's an unlimited number of large apartments and country estates and schooling and Lamborghinis. You can buy all of that stuff in the UK. And so naturally, if it's a choice between living somewhere that perhaps not everybody wants to live, but keeping your money safe, or living in the UK, keeping your money safe, nobody knows who you are, and you can spend everything, inevitably people just choose the British option.
Of course, and there may be some American listeners here who are listening to this and saying, well, we have all these things too. Why isn't the money in New York or in LA or in Miami? And of course, some of it is, right? But the big difference between the United States and the United Kingdom in this regard are very similar in all sorts of ways. Similar legal system, similar developed financial system, similar open economies, similar open societies, very welcoming to immigrants and so on. The big difference between the United Kingdom and the United States is that we don't have an enforcement mechanism to investigate your wealth once it gets here. There is no FBI, there is no Homeland Security investigations, there is no Southern District of New York in Britain. These things simply don't exist. There are formal equivalents of them, organizations that are supposed to fulfill the same roles, but they are so underfunded, they're so starved of resources that they are essentially just, pale shadows of the American equivalents. With a couple of journalist friends of mine, we occasionally joke that the National Crime Agency, which is nominally Britain's FBI, is actually just a press office, that once you get past the press office, there is no actual substance to it. That's not true. It does do some valuable work when it comes to combating sort of people trafficking and drug trafficking and so on. But when it comes to actually tackling high-level financial crime, it doesn't have the resources to do it. It doesn't have the ability to do it. And it doesn't really have the technical expertise, because its officers are so underpaid that as soon as they're well trained up, they tend to leave and go and get a job as a compliance officer for HSBC anyway.
When you lay it out like that, it does start to look like a deliberate policy choice.
Yes, I think it has a very deep roots. And I think at first it was a deliberate policy choice. I think it maintains itself by a degree of sort of inertia. But yes, back in the 1950s, which is when my story begins in the book, 1955 to 1956, Britain was in a real hole. It had these huge debts that had run up fighting the Second World War. Its empire had gone the way of all things, and the countries of the empire were becoming progressively independent. The main colonies, India and Pakistan and so on, had become independent, and the others were on their way out the door too. Britain was turning from the center of the world's biggest empire to being just another small European country, and a pretty rainy and grim one at that. And what's a country to do when it's lost an empire? Well, it still had the City of London. The City of London might not be the financial center of the British Empire anymore, but it still had the expertise and the contacts and the knowledge of how to move money around. So it reinvented itself. Accidentally, this is not planned and designed. It was something which bankers found their way to of their own accord. But once they found their way to it, they received a lot of encouragement from the Bank of England, their regulators. They found their way to not moving pounds through the British Empire, through what was called the sterling system, but instead moving dollars through a different system, what they called the offshore system. And this is a system that was dependent for its profitability on being less well regulated than the United States. So Britain's reinvention as an offshore economy depended on the fact that its bankers could move dollars more cheaply with fewer restrictions and regulations than their counterparts on Wall Street could do. And as soon as they started being able to do that, quite obviously, bankers from other countries, from Japan, from continental Europe, from the United States, came to the City of London to set up shop too, because it was as equally profitable for them to engage in offshore business as it was for British bankers. And so it was key to maintaining this new revenue stream for the British government. It was absolutely key that they retained this lower regulations than Wall Street. And the American government didn't take this lying down. They saw large amounts of their Wall Street dollar business disappearing and going to London. They didn't want to lose this revenue stream. So they reduced regulations in America, which meant Britain had to defend itself by reducing regulations further. So you end up with this race to the bottom that eventually sucks in all countries, and money starts moving, ever more freely and ever more profitably for the owners of wealth. But simply because the City of London needed to defend its business model by making sure it was always less regulated than Wall Street.
You present that part of the story, the post-Suez part, as a story of imperial decline. But it seemed to me that that's just as much a story of imperial continuity. So you say in the book that the British Empire was fundamentally just a mechanism for extracting wealth from the colonial periphery back to the imperial core. But now, by profiting from this overseas corruption, that's still more or less what the UK is doing. It's just another form of neo-colonialism.
Yeah, it's a really interesting argument, and I can see that point of view. I suppose where this is different to the past. I mean, if you look at it from a purely financial perspective, how the money flows, where it comes from, where it ends up, then that is absolutely the case that this is this is neo-colonial. I mean, completely. But where I think this is different is in the role of the UK. Now, in its origins, the British Empire was a private empire. It was a series of private companies chartered by the British government who were sent off around the world to trade slaves or loot India or loot Canada or loot whatever continent you happen to mention. But gradually they were they were nationalized, as it were, and they were brought under the control of the British government. So the British government was at the head of the empire. It was, the ultimate sort of buy-side client in financial services terms. What Britain is now is a sell-side operator. It sells services. It doesn't actually, as it were, commission those services itself. So I suppose, in a way, Britain's role now is a little bit like that of the tennis club at Wimbledon, the All England Tennis Club. It is vanishingly rare for a British person to win Wimbledon. It does occasionally happen, but I mean, let's face it, it's astonishingly rare. But Britain still hosts the world's premier tennis competition. So that's a little bit what Britain is like now. It makes sure it provides the centre for other people to come and enjoy, cream teas, wonderful green lawns, great facilities, and all that. So, Britain has become a place where other people are able to come and make money, while Britain earns its revenue from the fees that they pay, rather than a place that actually goes and makes these decisions for itself. So, is that a substantial difference? Obviously not, from the victims of looting in Nigeria or Malaysia or wherever. It doesn't make any difference to them who they get looted by. But I think there is a difference in the role of Britain of going from being a sort of a buy-side operator to a sell-side operator. It does end up with a different degree of agency, in that you have more freedom of movement if it's you who is the oligarch than you do if you are just the provider of services to oligarchs.
Well, that was why I wondered why you called it butler to the world and not banker to the world. But it sounds like that's the distinction, that it's to do with the power and influence that you wield.
Yeah, and also the services that Britain operates go far, far beyond those that are offered by a banker. This isn't purely a financial transaction. The origins of the offshore economy in the City of London are financial. They begin with banks and other financial services companies, but they have transformed widely into absolutely anything. So, legal services, accountancy services, actual butlering services. Britain is a big centre for training actual butlers. My favourite example is actually after my favourite recent example anyway is actually after the book was published. Alexei Navalny's researchers in Russia published a report into the ownership of a yacht called the Scheherazade, a super yacht. I think at the time it was the largest super yacht in the world of unknown ownership. And they say that the yacht actually belongs to Vladimir Putin. I understand that this is disputed, and it's not entirely clear whether it does or doesn't. But what was really interesting was the crew manifest all of the crew was Russian, and a lot of them were employed by the Kremlin in the sort of Russian equivalent of the US Secret Service, people whose job it is to protect the Kremlin and to protect the president. All of the crew was Russian except one, the captain, who was British. And that was a really pattern that is just repeated again and again and again, that you end up with these, the top of the tree, the top service level are British people, whether those are judges and lawyers in the sort of the Dubai, common law tribunal where business disputes are decided, or super yacht captains, or the people who bring the most expensive defamation proceedings, or you name it, whatever it is, that's the cachet of the British accent and the British sort of way of doing things. And it's quite clear to me anyway that essentially what Britain is offering is integration to the elite. It offers people of recent fortune integration to the aristocracy. We turn oligarchs into aristocrats. You get to play a real life version of Downton Abbey. That's what's being offered by Britain. And it's an astonishingly attractive offer for people of great wealth, because they continue coming here and they keep essentially buying this option for themselves and for their families.
Well, let's talk about Ukraine, because you wrote this book before the invasion of Ukraine, but it's made these issues much more topical. And as we talked about with the super yachts, it's sort of brought them into public attention. I wonder if you think that the war in Ukraine has made British friendliness towards Russian oligarch more difficult to justify politically than in the past.
It's undoubtable that it has caused a total rethink of Britain's approach towards Russian oligarchs. It is astonishing the rapidity of the governmental rethink. Back in the very early weeks of the year, a government minister resigned live in the House of Lords because of the government's failure to take financial crime seriously. Since then, we have had an Economic Crime Act. We are promised another one before the end of the year. We have had sanctions against hundreds of not just Russian oligarchs, but their hangers-on, their family members, and so on, and leading Russian figures. It's been an amazing turnaround. London has gone from being the favoured destination for wealthy Russians to being a genuinely hostile environment for them, and that's great in as far as it goes. However, it doesn't really go very far. You notice that we're only talking about Russian oligarchs here. We're not talking about oligarchs from all the other countries. London remains a very attractive destination for Ukrainian oligarchs, or Azeri oligarchs, Kazakh oligarchs, Kyrgyz oligarchs, Nigerian, Angolan, you name it.
It just keeps going. Yeah.
It keeps going. This is a wonderful, welcoming society for all of those people, and yet there's nothing intrinsically different about their wealth compared to the wealth of Russians. The only thing that's different is the fact that Putin invaded Ukraine. It wasn't a law enforcement response that made Britain suddenly get serious about Russian oligarchs. It was a foreign policy response. And that makes me worried, because what is required here is a law enforcement response, not a foreign policy response. So that's one point. And the second point, and this is a really important one, is that again and again and again, in response to crises, whether those are crises around financial crime or other things, but particularly for this context around financial crime, the British government's response has been to pass a law. Here we go, we've passed a law, the problem is solved. And they have never given the law enforcement agencies the resources they need to actually enforce that law. And that's the crucial difficulty that we're up against. That, yes, we have a new Economic Crime Act, great. And yes, we're going to get another one by the end of the year, great. But where's the money to enforce those laws?
So what would more effective laws or more effective measures look like, apart from giving more money to the enforcement agencies?
Well, the challenges are that we need more transparency, so we can see what's going on, so that the law enforcement agencies, in a way, find it easier to begin their investigations. And that means that we need a proper reform of Britain's tax havens. So those tax havens will be forced to publish the true owners of their shell companies. We also need a proper reform of Britain's own company registry, which is a far more problematic registry than the tax haven ones. It's far dodgier than the British Virgin Islands. So those two things would make a big difference in and of themselves. We need proper regulation of the enabler classes, the lawyers, the accountants, the reputation managers, and so on who help oligarchs to integrate their money and themselves into the global elite. If those people were prosecuted for when they do something wrong rather than, ignored, so those crimes ignored, that would make a big difference. It would change the calculation of the entire enabling class. And then the third, as I keep going on about, and I'm going to say it again, we just need to resource our investigative agencies properly. Times their budget by 5, times it by 6, and see how they get on. That is what really needs to happen. And that's, sadly, where we're very far away from that at the moment.
I wonder what you think the purpose of reporting on these issues is, or rather, maybe I should say, what do you hope the result of this kind of reporting will be?
Well, my motivation comes from the fact that we've always been obsessed by Eastern Europe. I'm not entirely sure why, but I always have been. And I moved there after I finished university back in the 1990s in the hope that I would see democratic transformation in Russia and the development of sort of freedom and a wonderful new way of living. And I didn't see that. Instead, I saw the country being looted and the re-establishment of a dictatorship, really, certainly an autocracy. And that makes me really angry, to be honest. And it makes me particularly angry that this looting that happened, quite possibly the biggest single campaign of looting there has ever been in terms of the amount of wealth that was stolen in such a short period of time, and this crushing of the democratic hopes of a generation. This didn't happen. This wasn't done just by the oligarchs. It was done with our active connivance. It was done with the assistance of Western politicians, Western enablers, and particularly British ones. And so what I would, initially my motivation is just to expose that, like a cockerel standing on a rooftop having a shout, that's all. And that makes me feel, better, to make sure that people actually know. People can't say, oh, we didn't know. That makes me feel better. Secondly, I hope to try and drive a degree of debate around changing what we do, the recognition that this isn't just morally wrong. This is, essentially stupid from the perspective of national security or the perspective of any kind of economic future for the world. If we wish to build a prosperous society, then we need to stop doing this kind of thing, because this is driving the world into a hole. I hope that I make that case, and I'll keep making that case until at least someone listens to me. And hopefully one day we'll win the argument, and then, I can retire and lie in a hammock for a bit.
Well, I think it's good to hear you talk about it in those terms, because I think sometimes when people talk about stolen money, they talk about it in terms of why it's bad for British democracy. But actually, the people who are most affected by the pipeline of dirty money flowing this way are the people who live in those kleptocratic regimes where the wealth is being stolen. As you talk about, that vast sums of money expropriated from Eastern Europe, which could really have helped in the post opening up and the development of those countries.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's bad for British democracy too. Oligarchs don't stop being oligarchs just because they're flown into Heathrow. They still want the same things they want at home. They want preferential access to the law and preferential access to politicians and all those things. Those things are bad here too. But yeah, the damage that has been done by kleptocracy is overwhelmingly something that's happened overseas. And the people in Ukraine or in Russia or in Azerbaijan or Nigeria, they don't get a vote here. So someone has to try and represent their point of view. And I'm part of a small group of journalists and troublemakers who try and do that.
I want to talk about one of the consequences of this amount of secrecy. And this is something to do that's called slap suits. These are strategic lawsuits against public participation. And they're libel lawsuits which are weaponized by very wealthy people against journalists and activists. And the idea is that it makes them frightened of scrutiny, or it makes the costs of that scrutiny very, very high. And they've become a favorite weapon among oligarchs. For instance, the reporter Catherine Belton was sued by Roman Abramovich last year over these allegations that she made in her book that he had bought Chelsea Football Club at the direction, at the behest of Putin himself. You yourself were the target of a slap suit last year. I wonder if you can talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think slap lawsuits it's like an irregular noun, isn't it? I mean, a slap lawsuit is something that someone else does.
Yeah.
So I'm sure the people who've brought this lawsuit against me would argue that it isn't a slap, and I'm sure they will have their time in court to make that point, that what I did was egregious and appalling. I'm being sued in Portugal by the vice president of Angola because of something I wrote in my last book, Moneyland, about the circumstances of the wedding of his daughter. I'm confident that the Portuguese court will decide that I did nothing wrong, and I'm quite looking forward to this being resolved because it's been hanging over me for a while. But and slaps are incredibly bad and annoying and time-consuming. And the cases brought against Catherine Belton and Tom Burgess or Carol Cadwallader and others, Scott Stedman, is going on at the moment in this country are a stain on Britain's reputation. Fortunately, hopefully anyway, the case in Portugal will not be nearly as expensive as an equivalent case in this country. But I just to put them into perspective, and I do think it's really important to remember this, that we still have things very lucky compared to journalists in other countries. I had several friends, journalists in Russia who have been killed in the course of their work. I have friends in other former Soviet countries who have been jailed, publicly shamed and humiliated because of their work. They've had their lives ruined. And so, yes, slap lawsuits are bad and they're a stain on our legal system. But, in a way, and this is just a sign of how bad things are in other countries, we still have things lucky.
But I wanted to get a sense of how you feel that suit has changed the way you work. I mean, you say it's not a lot of money. The figure I saw was 500,000 euros.
Oh, no,
which
no.
is,
I mean, no, the potential damages are enormous. Absolutely. No, it's more what the legal expenses to get to the point of the court case, fortunately, are lower in continental Europe than they are in the UK. An equivalent case, the legal costs in the UK would be far, far, far more than I could possibly manage.
Has that changed the way you work to some degree?
No, I'm always careful. I'm a responsible journalist. I don't throw allegations around lightly. I'd always try and do all the work I can do to make sure that what I report is as close to the truth as I can possibly uncover and discover. So I'm confident that the work I do is to the highest standards. Obviously there are some things it's hard to find out, but I do the best I can. I'm not just throwing around. I'm not a tabloid journalist just throwing around any old nonsense. So no, it hasn't changed how I work. I remain as careful as I always was. I think that if you're going to make serious allegations, then you need to be very serious about how you research them.
And putting your own experience of it to one side for a moment, more broadly, do you think that these slap suits have suppressed scrutiny in broad terms? Like, do you know of any?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I mean, you just need to talk to any British journalist who works in this area, and they will tell you multiple examples of stories that they are absolutely confident in the work that they did, but which they couldn't get published because an editor or a lawyer was too careful or too cautious. I mean, it's happened to me multiple times. So and every journalist I know who works in this area will be able to tell you the same stories. It's quite entertaining talking to American journalists who will say, "Oh, I had this story, but I couldn't quite stand it up." That's why they don't publish things. Whereas British journalists will say, "Oh, I had this story, but I couldn't get it past the lawyers, or I couldn't get it past the editors." It's not even a form of censorship. It is censorship.
It is because it's happening right now.
It's happening right now, and it's happening in the interests of anyone wealthy enough to afford a lawyer. The first question you are trained to ask yourself is, will this person sue? And one of the main reasons why you will say this person will sue is if that person is wealthy enough to afford a lawyer. It's the sad truth of how British journalism works, that journalists are all the time censoring themselves. Editors are censoring the copy they publish. Lawyers are censoring the copy they check, simply because they're worried that certain people will bring legal proceedings. And it's not, it isn't really about the nature of the article necessarily, to a certain extent. It's mainly about the nature of the plaintiff. Are they litigious? Are they wealthy? Do they have grounds to sue? Those are the questions you ask.
Before we finish off, I wanted to ask you about your role as a tour guide doing these kleptocracy tours around London. So these are basically tours of London that focus on the real estate owned by the post-Soviet oligarchs and so on, the shady characters. And it's a creative way of drawing attention to it. I wanted to ask you where the idea came about.
Yeah, I wish it had been my idea. I'm not claiming any credit at all for that. As soon as I heard it, I was like, yes, I want to do that. But it was my friend Roman Borisovich, I think, in conversation with another friend of ours, who came up with the idea. And it was just essentially looking for amusing ways, creative, eye-catching ways of exposing London's role as a destination for kleptocratic cash.
I did think
that was all. And the idea was, it's modeled on the Hollywood tours. You drive around Hollywood and look at houses that belong to film stars. You drive around London and look at houses that belong to oligarchs. That's the basic calculation. And they work far better, I suppose, than we could have calculated. They really kind of caught the public eye.
I thought, aren't you worried that these nouveau riche oligarchs might use it as a way to tour potential places to buy? And so that the first thing that occurred to me, that
we haven't yet had an oligarch on the bus. I have occasionally been asked to do sort of private guides, private tours for sort of wealthy, for a group of wealthy financiers or whatever. But I'd like to. I have never done that. But I think their idea is mainly from a compliance perspective rather than a looking for investment opportunities. I think that there is a far more effective and efficient bespoke real estate solution available to oligarchs than our kleptocracy tours, when they'd have to share a bus with a load of ordinary members of the public, and that would be ghastly.
But there is a serious side to it, because part of the point of the book is to point out that all of this wealth is utterly invisible. And sometimes when you actually see it, when you drive around and you see these palatial palaces, and you see them right in front of you, and that is owned by an offshore company and nobody knows who it's owned by, it makes some of these issues very, very visceral. People start to feel them in the way they don't feel, as we were saying at the very beginning, whatever a trillion is, or 200 billion, whatever these large sums mean.
Yeah, I mean, that was the hope, really. You could say, look, that house there, that mansion there, that luxury duplex apartment, that belongs to a man who got his wealth by stealing an oil company or whatever, because he's the son of certain oligarch, or she's the daughter of a president or whatever. Yes, that's the idea, is to make it visible, and also, just to make it impossible for people to say they didn't know, because it's easy to walk around West London and assume all those houses belong to, old money English aristocrats or Richard Branson or whoever. It's easy to think that, but and a lot of them do, but also a lot of them don't. And so the point is to strip away that ability to say we didn't know. That's what I try and do.
Oliver Bullough, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Oliver's book, Butler to the World: How Britain Became the Servant of Tycoons, Tax Dodgers, Kleptocrats and Criminals, is published in the United States this month. This week's podcast was produced by Joshua Martin and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. You can subscribe to the New Lines magazine podcast on your favorite podcast app. And of course, you can find more of the best stories from the Middle East and beyond on our website, newlinesmag.com. Thank you all.